On the afternoon of February 11th, 1982, in a modest second-floor apartment on Rue de Maubeuge in the 9th arrondissement of Paris, a French intelligence officer named Pierre Bourdiol sat across a small kitchen table from a man who had just handed him what would become one of the most significant intelligence breaches of the Cold War. A light rain had been falling since morning, and the gray afternoon light filtered through the apartment's curtains, creating an atmosphere of quiet tension. The man's name was Vladimir Ippolitovich Vetrov. He was 53 years old, stocky with graying hair and the slightly rumpled appearance of a career bureaucrat. He was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB's first chief directorate, and for reasons that even he would later struggle to fully articulate, he had decided to betray the Soviet Union by providing France with detailed documentation of the Soviet government's most extensive technology theft operation. The apartment belonged to Bourdiol's mistress, a precaution that reflected the sensitivity of the meeting. Bourdiol, 48 years old, tall and carefully groomed with the manner of an educated professional, had been working for the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, France's domestic intelligence agency, for 17 years. He had cultivated Vetrov as a source over several months, beginning with casual encounters at diplomatic receptions and gradually developing the relationship through shared meals and conversations about literature and philosophy. Vetrov had given indications that he possessed valuable information, but nothing had prepared Bourdiol for what the Soviet officer placed on the table that afternoon: a stack of photocopied documents approximately 3 inches thick, the pages still smelling faintly of toner from the copying machine. The documents, Vetrov explained in his accented French, represented just the beginning. They were internal KGB memoranda, technical assessments, and operational summaries related to Directorate T, the KGB division responsible for acquiring Western technology through espionage. The material detailed hundreds of active operations, identified Soviet intelligence officers operating under cover in Western countries, named Western scientists and engineers who were providing information to the Soviet Union, and outlined the specific technologies the Soviet government was attempting to acquire. Before we continue with how this single meeting would unravel the largest Soviet technology theft operation in history, if you're drawn to these documented accounts of Cold War intelligence operations and the real human cost behind espionage, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these verified cases every week, bringing you the factual record behind some of the Cold War's most consequential secrets. Now, let's examine how one man's disillusionment would reshape the final decade of the Cold War. Vetrov's decision to provide this information would eventually lead to the exposure and dismantling of a vast Soviet intelligence network, the expulsion of dozens of Soviet intelligence officers from Western countries, and a fundamental reassessment by Western governments of Soviet technological capabilities and espionage priorities. But on that February afternoon in Paris, as Bourdiol carefully placed the documents into a leather briefcase and asked Vetrov when they could meet again, neither man could have anticipated the full scope of consequences that would follow from this single act of betrayal. Vladimir Vetrov had been born in 1932 in Novokuznetsk, an industrial city in Siberia where winter temperatures routinely dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. His father had worked in the city's steel mills, and his mother had been a schoolteacher. According to biographical information compiled years later by French and American intelligence services, Vetrov had been an academically gifted student with particular strengths in languages and mathematics. He had attended Moscow State University, studying electrical engineering, and had graduated in 1955 with honors. His academic performance and his demonstrated fluency in French and English had brought him to the attention of KGB recruiters, and in 1956, at the age of 24, he had been offered a position with Soviet foreign intelligence. Vetrov's early career followed a conventional path for a promising KGB officer. After training in intelligence tradecraft and technical analysis, he received his first foreign posting to Paris in 1965, working under diplomatic cover as a science and technology attaché, while his actual role was recruiting sources for Directorate T. The Paris posting proved formative for Vetrov in ways the KGB had not anticipated. He developed an affinity for French culture that went beyond operational necessity. He learned to appreciate French wine, spent weekends exploring the city's bookshops and cafes, and formed genuine friendships with French citizens. According to later accounts from people who knew him during this period, Vetrov seemed more comfortable in Paris than he would later appear upon his return to Moscow. He spoke French fluently with only a slight accent, could discuss Balzac and Flaubert with enthusiasm, and adopted French mannerisms in his gestures and expressions. In 1970, after 5 years in Paris, Vetrov was recalled to Moscow. The official reason given was routine rotation, but colleagues later suggested that KGB leadership had become concerned about his degree of assimilation into French society. Upon his return to the Soviet Union, Vetrov was assigned to a desk position at KGB headquarters in Moscow, where he worked as an analyst, evaluating intelligence reports from Directorate T operations across Western Europe and North America. The transition from Paris to Moscow was difficult. He missed France, resented what he perceived as his demotion to desk work, and struggled with the constraints of Soviet life after 5 years of relative freedom. He married in 1972 to a woman named Svetlana, who worked as a translator at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They had one child, a son named Mikhail, born in 1974. By all outward appearances, Vetrov settled into the role of a mid-level Soviet bureaucrat living in a modest 3-room apartment in southwest Moscow, taking the metro to work each day at Lubyanka Square, attending required political meetings, and performing his duties with adequate but not exceptional competence. What was not visible to his colleagues or to KGB counterintelligence officers was Vetrov's growing disillusionment with the Soviet system, a disillusionment that had been building for years and that would eventually lead him to betray everything he had spent his career defending. In 1981, at the age of 49, Vetrov received a temporary 6-month assignment back to Paris to assist with a specific Directorate T operation. During this posting, he encountered Pierre Bourdieu at a reception at the Soviet embassy in September 1981. The two men discovered a shared interest in Russian literature, and Bourdieu suggested they meet for lunch to continue the conversation. What Vetrov either did not know or chose to ignore was that Bourdieu was not merely a French businessman with cultural interests, but an intelligence officer whose assignment was to cultivate potential sources among Soviet diplomats and officials. The relationship developed over several months during late 1981. They met for lunches at quiet restaurants in the 5th and 6th arrondissements, attended concerts at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, discussed Dostoevsky and Turgenev over wine at left-bank cafes. Bourdieu was careful not to pressure Vetrov or make explicit requests for information. Instead, he allowed the relationship to develop naturally while occasionally making comments that suggested understanding for Vetrov's apparent frustrations with Soviet constraints. At some point during these months, the exact moment would never be definitively established, Vetrov made the decision to provide classified information to French intelligence. The motivations that drove this choice were complex and had been accumulating over years. According to information he would later provide, he had been troubled by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, which he had witnessed during his time in Paris, and which contradicted the ideals he had been taught about Soviet socialism. Working as an analyst for Directorate T, he had reviewed reports showing that Soviet engineers were copying Western designs rather than developing original innovations. that Soviet factories produced inferior versions of Western products, and that the Soviet economy was fundamentally unable to compete with the West in technological development. This knowledge undermined whatever remaining belief Vetrov held in Soviet superiority. When questioned about his motivations years later during the investigation following his arrest, Vetrov offered varying explanations. He emphasized ideological disillusionment with Soviet communism. He mentioned resentment over his treatment by KGB leadership and his stalled career. He expressed genuine admiration for France and a desire to assist a country he felt connection to. Psychological assessments conducted after his arrest suggested he was also driven by a need for validation and importance, something he felt he lacked within the KGB bureaucracy. All these factors converged to make Vetrov vulnerable to a choice he must have known carried the risk of execution. When Vetrov returned to Moscow at the end of his temporary Paris posting in December 1981, he took with him photocopies of numerous classified documents from Directorate T files. These copies had been made during his regular work activities, as his position gave him legitimate access to the files for analytical purposes. KGB document security procedures required that all copying be logged, but Vetrov had sufficient authority and trust that his requests were not closely scrutinized. Vetrov and Betrayal had agreed on a communication protocol before Vetrov's departure. Vetrov would indicate his willingness to meet by sending a postcard to a specific address in Paris, a safe house maintained by French intelligence. The postcard would appear to be ordinary tourist correspondence, perhaps commenting on Moscow's winter weather or mentioning a book he had read, and would contain no suspicious content. But its arrival would signal that Vetrov had documents to provide and was prepared to travel. Betrayal would then arrange for a meeting, either in a third country during one of Vetrov's authorized business trips, or, on rare occasions, in Moscow itself, using French intelligence officers stationed at the French embassy. The first substantial package of documents that Vetrov provided in February 1982 shocked French intelligence analysts when they began reviewing the material. The documents revealed that Directorate T employed approximately 400 officers worldwide whose sole function was to acquire Western technology through espionage. They showed that the Soviet Union had identified more than 3,000 specific Western technologies it was attempting to acquire, ranging from computer hardware and software to manufacturing processes to weapons systems designs. They listed hundreds of Western citizens who were providing information to Soviet intelligence, including scientists at research laboratories, engineers at defense contractors, businessmen at technology companies, and academic researchers at universities. The material revealed the organizational structure of Directorate T, the methods it used to recruit sources, the techniques it employed to transfer stolen information back to the Soviet Union, and the ways acquired technology was distributed to Soviet research institutes and manufacturing facilities. French analysts realized they were looking at a comprehensive blueprint of Soviet technology theft operations, information that would allow Western governments to identify and neutralize Soviet intelligence networks across Europe and North America. But this presented a dilemma. The material was so sensitive and valuable that sharing it widely risked exposing Vetrov as the source. Yet keeping it exclusively within French intelligence meant forgoing the opportunity to coordinate a comprehensive Western response to Soviet technology theft. After consultation at the highest levels of the French government, including President François Mitterrand, who was briefed on the source in March 1982, the decision was made to share the intelligence with the United States while taking precautions to protect Vetrov's identity. The material would be presented as coming from a highly sensitive source whose identity could not be revealed even to American intelligence partners. In July 1982, French intelligence officials met with representatives of the CIA in Washington. They provided selected documents from what had become known within French intelligence as the Farewell Dossier, a code name derived from the French word adieu, which Vetrov had adopted as his operational alias. The CIA officials who reviewed the material immediately recognized its significance. The Farewell Dossier represented the most comprehensive intelligence on Soviet technology theft operations that Western governments had ever obtained. President Ronald Reagan was briefed on the Farewell Dossier in August 1982 at the White House. According to declassified records of that briefing, Reagan immediately grasped both the strategic value of the intelligence and the opportunity it presented. The material showed that Soviet military and industrial capabilities were far more dependent on stolen Western technology than American intelligence agencies had previously understood. It also provided an opportunity to undermine those capabilities by identifying and eliminating Soviet access to Western technology. What followed was a coordinated Western counterintelligence campaign of unprecedented scope. The CIA, working in coordination with French intelligence and with the intelligence services of other NATO countries, began systematically identifying and neutralizing the Soviet technology theft networks exposed in the Farewell Dossier. The approach varied depending on circumstances. In some cases, Soviet intelligence officers identified in the documents were placed under surveillance to learn more about their operations before being expelled. In other cases, Western citizens identified as providing information to the Soviets were arrested or recruited as double agents. In still other cases, the Western response was more subtle, involving the provision of subtly flawed or modified technology that would appear genuine but would fail or malfunction when used by the Soviets. Between late 1982 and 1985, more than 200 Soviet intelligence officers were expelled from Western countries based on information from the Farewell Dossier. These expulsions were coordinated to occur gradually rather than all at once, to avoid making it obvious that a comprehensive intelligence breach had occurred. Soviet intelligence officers were declared persona non grata from France, West Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and the United States. Nevertheless, the scale of the expulsions and the precision with which they targeted Directorate T officers created significant concern within KGB leadership about a possible security breach. One of the more creative responses to the Farewell Dossier was proposed by the CIA and approved by President Reagan in late 1982. The Farewell materials had identified a Soviet effort to acquire control system software for a planned natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe. This pipeline, stretching more than 3,000 miles from Urengoy in Siberia to the Soviet Union's western border, represented a massive infrastructure project designed to generate hard currency through gas exports to Western Europe. The Soviets needed sophisticated control systems to manage the pipeline's pumps, valves, and pressure monitoring equipment, and they had targeted Canadian suppliers to acquire this technology. The CIA arranged for Canadian suppliers to provide the software to Soviet procurement agents, but the software had been modified to include malicious code. The modifications were subtle enough to avoid detection during testing, but designed to cause catastrophic failure after several months of operation. According to accounts from CIA officials involved in the operation, the modified software functioned normally after the pipeline became operational in June 1982. Then, on a night in late summer, the hidden code triggered pumps to operate at pressures far beyond safety limits while simultaneously disabling pressure relief systems and safety shutoffs. The explosion that resulted was massive. American satellites monitoring the region detected a bright flash visible from space followed by an enormous fireball that burned for hours as natural gas ignited along a section of the pipeline. The blast destroyed several kilometers of pipeline, killed workers at a nearby monitoring station, and created a crater visible in satellite imagery. Soviet authorities initially attributed the explosion to accidental equipment failure, but engineers investigating the incident eventually concluded that the control software had malfunctioned. The explosion delayed the pipeline's full operation by more than a year, cost the Soviet Union hundreds of millions of rubles in repairs and lost revenue, and demonstrated to Soviet leadership the risks of relying on stolen technology that might contain hidden sabotage. Throughout 1982 and 1983, Vetrov continued to provide material to French intelligence. He made several trips to Western Europe on official KGB business, to Vienna in May 1982, to Brussels in September 1982, and to West Berlin in January 1983, during which he met with Bourdieu and provided additional documents. He also developed a protocol for leaving material at dead drops in Moscow, which French intelligence officers stationed at the French embassy would retrieve. Between February 1982 and early 1983, Vetrov provided more than 4,000 pages of classified KGB documents to French intelligence. But Vetrov's espionage carried enormous personal risk, and that risk increased as months passed and as Western governments began acting on the intelligence he was providing. The pattern of Soviet intelligence officer expulsions from Western countries, while carefully orchestrated to appear unrelated, created a growing sense within KGB headquarters that something was wrong. Counterintelligence investigations were launched to identify possible security breaches. Vetrov's position as an analyst gave him access to reports about these investigations, and he knew he was operating under increasing danger of discovery. What ultimately led to Vetrov's exposure, however, was not KGB counterintelligence, but rather events in his personal life that had nothing to do with espionage. Vetrov had been having an affair with a woman named Ludmila, the wife of another KGB officer. The affair had been ongoing for several months and had become increasingly troubled. According to later court testimony, Ludmila had grown concerned about Vetrov's increasingly erratic behavior, his heavy drinking, his mood swings, his paranoia about being followed. She had threatened to end the relationship, which had sent Vetrov into emotional turmoil. On the evening of February 22, 1983, a cold Tuesday night with temperatures well below freezing, Vetrov and Ludmila arranged to meet in his car in a secluded area of Moscow near Sokolniki Park. The meeting was supposed to be a final conversation about their relationship. Instead, it turned into an argument. Ludmila told Vetrov she could no longer continue the affair and suggested he needed psychological help. According to Vetrov's later confession, he felt a sudden, overwhelming rage and loss of control. He attacked Ludmila with a knife he had brought with him, stabbing her multiple times in the chest and abdomen. Ludmila screamed and tried to escape from the vehicle. Her screams attracted the attention of a KGB officer named Vasily Kramenov, who happened to be walking nearby through the park. Kramenov, 34 years old and assigned to the KGB's 7th Directorate, responsible for surveillance of foreigners, ran toward the sound of the screams. When Kramenov approached the vehicle and saw what was happening, Vetrov, in a state of complete panic, attacked him as well. He stabbed Kramenov multiple times in the chest and neck before fleeing the scene on foot, leaving both victims bleeding in the snow beside his car. A pedestrian who had heard the commotion called for help. Both Ludmila and Kramenov survived the attacks but were seriously injured. Ludmila required emergency surgery for punctured lungs and internal bleeding. Kramenov suffered severe blood loss and would require months of recovery. Vetrov fled to his apartment, where he spent several hours in a state of shock before Moscow police, who had identified him from his vehicle registration, arrived to arrest him. When officers knocked on his door at approximately 2:30 in the morning on February 23, 1983, Vetrov answered, still wearing blood-stained clothing. He was arrested without resistance and taken into custody. The arrest for attempted murder led to a search of Vetrov's apartment and his office at KGB headquarters. During these searches, investigators found materials that immediately indicated espionage. In Vetrov's apartment, hidden in a false bottom of a desk drawer in his small study, investigators discovered notes written in French, contact information for Pierre Bourdieu, including a Paris telephone number and safe-house address, and photocopies of classified documents that had no legitimate reason to be in his personal possession. In his office at KGB headquarters, investigators found evidence that he had been copying documents beyond what his analytical duties required, including access logs showing he had requested files from departments unrelated to his work responsibilities. Vetrov was transferred from police custody to KGB counterintelligence within 24 hours of his arrest. The Lubyanka prison, in the basement of KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square, would become his home for the next 10 months. Interrogations began immediately. According to records from these interrogations that were partially declassified after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vetrov initially denied espionage and claimed the materials found in his possession were related to his authorized analytical work. But confronted with the overwhelming evidence, particularly the notes in French, the contact information for a known French intelligence officer, and the unauthorized document copies, he eventually acknowledged that he had been providing classified information to French intelligence for approximately 1 year. The interrogations of Vetrov continued for several months during the spring and summer of 1983. KGB counterintelligence officers methodically documented what information Vetrov had provided, when he had provided it, how the material had been transferred, what compensation he had received, and what had motivated him. They also attempted to assess the damage, what operations had been compromised, what sources had been exposed, what capabilities had been lost. As the interrogations progressed, and as KGB analysts correlated Vetrov's confession with the pattern of Western counterintelligence actions over the previous year, leadership began to understand the scale of the breach. The Farewell Dossier had exposed virtually the entire Directorate T operation, years of intelligence work, hundreds of carefully cultivated sources, and the Soviet Union's primary mechanism for acquiring Western technology. The wave of expulsions that had been occurring throughout 1982 and early 1983 could now be understood as a coordinated Western response to this comprehensive intelligence breach. French intelligence learned of Vetrov's arrest through their sources within the Soviet government, though details remained unclear for several months. Pierre Bourdieu, who had been Vetrov's primary handler, was withdrawn from field operations and reassigned to desk duties at DST headquarters in Paris, standard procedure when a source was compromised. The French government prepared for possible diplomatic consequences, but the Soviet government chose not to make Vetrov's espionage a public matter, apparently preferring to handle the situation quietly rather than advertise the extent of the breach. Vladimir Vetrov was tried in a closed military court in Moscow in December 1983 on charges of espionage against the Soviet Union and attempted murder. According to the limited information available about the trial, which was conducted in secret at a KGB military tribunal, he pleaded guilty to both charges. He offered limited explanation for his espionage, acknowledging disillusionment with the Soviet system, but also expressing what the court records described as remorse, particularly for the violent attacks on Ludmila and Vasily Kramenov. The judges, unsympathetic to any explanation for betraying the Soviet Union, sentenced him to death by firing squad. The sentence was carried out on January 23, 1984, at a KGB execution facility outside Moscow. Vetrov was executed by firing squad at dawn. He was 51 years old. According to protocol, his family was not notified of the execution until after it had occurred. His wife, Svetlana, received official notification 2 days later that her husband had been executed for crimes against the state. Their son, Mikhail, was 9 years old. Like other children of executed traitors in the Soviet system, Mikhail would grow up bearing the stigma of his father's treason. The consequences of the Farewell Dossier extended far beyond Vetrov's execution. The intelligence he provided fundamentally altered the balance of power in technology competition between the Soviet Union and the West during the final decade of the Cold War. Western governments, armed with comprehensive knowledge of what technologies the Soviets were attempting to steal and through what methods, were able to protect sensitive technologies much more effectively. Soviet efforts to acquire Western technology, while continuing after the Farewell breach, became significantly more difficult and less successful. The economic impact on the Soviet Union was substantial. Soviet military and industrial planners, who had been relying on a steady flow of acquired Western technology, found that flow severely disrupted. Development programs for weapons systems and industrial capabilities were delayed or abandoned when anticipated technology acquisitions did not materialize. The Soviet economy, already strained by military spending and structural inefficiencies, was further weakened by its inability to maintain technological parity with the West through espionage. When Western intelligence analysts gained access to Soviet archives after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, they found that the Farewell Dossier had been remarkably accurate. Soviet computer technology, which had been regarded by Western intelligence as independently developed, was revealed to have been almost entirely based on stolen Western designs and components. Soviet manufacturing facilities were producing copies of Western systems, often with inferior components. When Western technology transfer was disrupted following the Farewell breach, Soviet computer development essentially stalled for several years. Similarly, Soviet aircraft design incorporated numerous stolen Western innovations, wind tunnel data, materials specifications, avionics designs, and manufacturing processes had all been acquired through Directorate T operations. The disruption of these acquisition channels forced Soviet designers to work with inadequate data and inferior materials, resulting in less capable and less reliable aircraft. For Svetlana Vetrov and her son Mikhail, the aftermath of Vladimir's execution brought immediate and lasting consequences. Svetlana was subjected to intensive interrogation by KGB investigators seeking to determine whether she had known about her husband's espionage activities. The investigators eventually concluded she had no knowledge of his betrayal, but the social stigma of being married to an executed traitor was severe. She lost her job at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within weeks of being informed of Vladimir's execution. Friends and colleagues avoided her. She was forced to move from her apartment in Moscow to a smaller apartment in a less desirable neighborhood on the city's outskirts, standard treatment for families of executed traitors. She worked menial jobs for minimal pay, cleaning offices, working in factory cafeterias, and raised Mikhail alone under the constant shadow of his father's crimes. Mikhail grew up knowing that his father had been executed by the state for treason, but understanding little about what that actually meant. In Soviet society, being the child of a traitor carried lifelong consequences. Educational opportunities were limited. University admission committees reviewed applicants' family backgrounds, and having an executed traitor as a father was grounds for automatic rejection, regardless of academic performance. Career opportunities were similarly constrained. Government employment, military service, and positions requiring any level of security clearance were permanently closed to children of traitors. Social relationships were affected, as other families discouraged their children from associating with the sons or daughters of enemies of the state. According to information that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Mikhail struggled throughout his youth with depression, confusion, and anger about his father's choices and their impact on his life. His mother's attempts to explain were hampered by her own limited understanding and by her desire to protect her young son from harsh realities. Mikhail spent much of his childhood believing that his father had made some kind of mistake at work and had been punished unfairly. Only as a teenager did he begin to understand the true nature of his father's crimes, that Vladimir had deliberately betrayed the Soviet Union to France, had provided thousands of classified documents to Western intelligence, and had been executed for espionage. This understanding brought shame and resentment that would affect him for decades. In 1992, several years after the Soviet Union's collapse, French intelligence officials contacted Svetlana and Mikhail through intermediaries to offer them financial assistance in recognition of the intelligence that Vladimir Vetrov had provided to France. The French government, acting on recommendations from DST leadership, established a modest trust fund that provided financial support. The gesture was partly humanitarian, acknowledging that Svetlana and Mikhail had suffered consequences for Vladimir's choices, but it was also partly political, intended to demonstrate France's commitment to protecting sources and their families, even when those sources were caught and executed. Mikhail, by then in his late 20s and working low-wage jobs in Moscow's emerging market economy, accepted the assistance but struggled with complicated feelings about his father. In limited interviews he gave to journalists researching the Farewell Dossier case in the mid-1990s, he expressed anger at his father for choices that had destroyed their family and limited his own opportunities. He described growing up as an outcast, being denied university admission despite strong grades, being rejected from jobs, being avoided by potential friends once they learned his family history. But he also expressed some understanding of his father's motivations and acknowledged that Vladimir had been acting according to his convictions, however misguided those convictions might have been. He declined to characterize his father as either a hero or a traitor, suggesting instead that the question was more complex than such simple categories allowed. Pierre Bourdieu, Vetrov's French handler, continued his career in French intelligence until his retirement in 1993. He was recognized within French intelligence circles as having run one of the most successful recruitment operations in modern espionage history, though his role remained classified for many years. After retirement, he occasionally gave interviews to researchers and journalists studying Cold War espionage. In these conversations, Bourdieu expressed mixed feelings about the Vetrov case. He acknowledged the strategic value of the intelligence and took professional pride in having successfully cultivated and handled such a valuable source. But he also expressed sympathy for Vetrov as an individual, describing him as a fundamentally decent man who had become disillusioned with a system he had served loyally for decades and who had ultimately paid with his life for his decision to betray that system. The Farewell Dossier case became a model studied by intelligence agencies worldwide as an example of how a single, well-placed source could provide strategic intelligence that fundamentally altered international competition. It influenced how intelligence agencies thought about recruiting sources, handling sensitive intelligence, and coordinating international counterintelligence responses. It shaped debates about export controls, technology protection, and the balance between security and openness in democratic societies. The case was taught at intelligence training facilities, analyzed in classified studies, and referenced in policy debates about technology security for decades after Vetrov's execution. Some historians and former intelligence officials have argued that the Farewell Dossier contributed significantly to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. While the Soviet system's failure had multiple causes, economic mismanagement, political rigidity, ideological bankruptcy, the costs of military competition with the West, nationalist movements in Soviet republics, the loss of access to Western technology through espionage, removed one mechanism the Soviet Union had been using to compensate for its technological and economic weaknesses. Unable to innovate at Western levels and no longer able to systematically acquire Western innovations through theft, the Soviet Union fell further behind economically and technologically during the 1980s, contributing to the crisis that culminated in the system's collapse. The question of Vetrov's motivations remained a subject of analysis among intelligence professionals and historians for years after his death. The available evidence suggests his decision to commit espionage reflected a convergence of multiple factors rather than any single cause. He had served the Soviet system for more than 25 years before deciding to betray it. His disillusionment had built gradually over years, influenced by events and by his growing understanding of the Soviet Union's technological dependence on the West. His relationship with Betrayal had provided both opportunity and catalyst, and his personal psychology, his need for validation, his resentment of authority, his attraction to French culture, had made him susceptible to making a choice he must have known carried the risk of execution. The impact on individuals who had no agency in these events illustrated the human cost of intelligence operations regardless of their strategic justification. Neither Svetlana nor Mikhail had chosen anything related to Vladimir's espionage. Svetlana had married a man she believed to be a loyal Soviet officer and had built a life based on that understanding. Mikhail had been a child who loved his father. The fact that Vladimir's espionage might have been strategically valuable to the West or morally justified by Soviet oppression did not reduce the harm his choices caused to his family. Svetlana died in 2003 at the age of 67, having spent more than 20 years as the widow of an executed traitor. According to those who knew her in her later years, she had built a quiet life, working modest jobs, maintaining limited social contacts, never remarrying. She had dealt with the trauma and stigma of her husband's crimes by withdrawing from society and focusing on survival. Mikhail survived into the 21st century, but struggled with substance abuse and depression that he attributed in part to his childhood experiences. In his final known interview, given in 2007 to a documentary filmmaker researching Cold War espionage, he acknowledged that he had never fully come to terms with his father's choices or with his own identity as the son of a traitor and spy. He recognized intellectually that his father had acted according to his convictions and that those convictions might have been justified given the nature of the Soviet system. But emotionally, he could not forgive his father for choosing abstractions, ideology, conviction, opposition to Soviet communism, over the concrete reality of his family and his son's childhood. In the decades following the Farewell Dossier case, intelligence professionals and historians continued to debate whether such operations could be justified given their profound harm to innocent people. From the perspective of Western intelligence and defense officials, the strategic value of the Farewell Dossier far outweighed the personal costs to one Soviet intelligence officer and his family. From Mikhail's perspective, no strategic intelligence was worth the destruction of his childhood and the limitation of his life opportunities. From Vladimir's own perspective, expressed in fragmentary comments during interrogations and trial testimony, The answer seemed to oscillate between conviction that he had done the right thing and regret for the consequences to those he loved. The documents Vetrov provided to French intelligence, 4,000 pages of photocopied KGB files, eventually became the subject of extensive historical study after their declassification in the late 1990s. Researchers examined them to understand Soviet technology theft operations, to document the extent of Western technology's contribution to Soviet capabilities, and to assess the intelligence value of the material. But those documents also represented something else: the accumulated work of hundreds of Soviet intelligence officers over decades, the product of thousands of individual recruitment operations and source relationships, the documentation of a vast system designed to compensate for the Soviet Union's inability to generate innovation through its own economic and scientific structures. When Vladimir Vetrov handed those documents to Pierre Bourdieu on that rainy February afternoon in Paris in 1982, he was handing over not just classified information, but the accumulated intelligence effort of his entire organization. He was exposing not just current operations, but the system and methods through which those operations had been conducted for years. Whether he fully understood the magnitude of what he was doing is unclear. In his interrogations after his arrest, he seemed at times surprised by the extent of the Western response to his intelligence and by the scale of the damage his espionage had caused. A photograph that Pierre Bourdieu took of Vetrov during one of their meetings in Paris, a photograph that remained classified for many years and was eventually declassified after the Soviet Union's collapse, shows a middle-aged man in an unremarkable dark suit sitting in a café on Boulevard Saint-Germain, looking slightly uncomfortable. There is nothing in the image that suggests espionage or betrayal or the historical consequences that would follow from this man's decision to hand over thousands of classified documents. He looks like what he was before he became a spy, and what he would have remained had he not made that choice. An ordinary Soviet bureaucrat, somewhat disillusioned, somewhat resentful, somewhat nostalgic for his years in Paris, trying to make sense of his life and his place in systems larger than himself. Vladimir Vetrov was 49 years old when he made the decision to provide classified information to French intelligence. He was 51 when he faced a firing squad in Moscow. In between, he provided intelligence of historic strategic value while simultaneously destroying everything personal in his life that had meaning. The files he provided helped reshape the final decade of the Cold War and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet system. They also cost him his life, destroyed his family, sentenced his son to a childhood of shame and limitation, and left his wife to decades of stigma and hardship. The gap between strategic success and human tragedy in his case was absolute, and no amount of historical analysis or strategic assessment could bridge it or make it make sense to those who paid the highest price for his choices.